Hi, I'm Mark Thorsby, and this is an introduction to political philosophy. Our topic today is building society, and what I'm going to be talking about here is the philosophical foundation that John Locke sets forth in terms of legitimating civil authority. Now, that means what I'm going to give you in this video is a general introduction to John Locke's political philosophy. There's lots of nuances and interesting ideas that I'm not going to have time to talk about, so as always, I encourage you to read the entire second treatise on government as soon as you can, and then you'll see that there's wonderful nuance that John Locke provides. But in general, by the end of today's video, I think you'll have a pretty good understanding of how John Locke is an innovator in general when it comes to political social philosophy. Now, let me start with John Locke's general biography, and of course there's because of the time constraints of this video series, normally I find I'm making these videos a little over an hour long. I can't cover everything, so again, I always encourage you to do some additional research to help augment and broaden and enrich in your own understanding. Now, John Locke was born in 1632 and he died in 1704. Now, what I've done here in terms of the sort of biography here, I've put down a couple key things that are probably historically helpful in understanding John Locke. John Locke, who was actually born to a Protestant family, and we'll see that he was resistant to Catholicism throughout his entire life. Now, in 1649, oops, I don't know what that is saying. In 1649, Charles I was executed, and this initiated here the English Civil War, in which Oliver Cromwell took over and so on and so forth. We actually mentioned it last time in our video series as well. During that time period, in 1652, actually, John Locke is educated at Oxford University. He went to Christ Church, and Christ Church, I went to Christ Church this summer, so I threw a couple photos in here for you to take a look at. Here's a picture of Christ Church in Oxford. Now, many of you may not be familiar with Oxford, but Oxford is a city, and in that city are a whole series of colleges. And anyone who goes to those colleges is a student of Oxford University. And one of the most prominent of all the colleges is called Christ Church. At the very heart of that college is a cathedral. Christ Church Cathedral, and this is what you're looking at here. Here's another picture. This is the outside, I think, of one of the dormitories actually at Christ Church. Now, John Locke went to school there. Originally, he was educated in as a doctor, but eventually he was unable to actually pass his examinations to be considered an actual physician. And so he started writing and doing a lot of different things. He even took work as an ambassador at one point. And by the end of his life, John Locke probably became the world's most famous intellectual. Now, interestingly enough, he was never, even though he actually spent a couple decades at Christ Church teaching as a student and then teaching there, when he sort of wrote his most important works here, an essay concerning human understanding and the two treatises on government, he actually was in exile, and he didn't write them as a professor. He wrote them as a public intellectual, and his audience wasn't these sorts of codgy, academic, cigar parlor smoking philosophers. His audience was actually the general educated public in England in general. And that's part of one of the reasons his ideas had so much impact on the wider world, and especially for us, those of us in the United States, because our own political system is essentially modeled after John Locke's second treatise on government. Now, but that's where he was educated at Christ Church. In 1660, the monarchy was restored. Which meant that it went from the Cromwell's revolution failed, the monarchy was reestablished. Now, in 1683, Locke flees to the Netherlands, and he's forced to flee to the Netherlands because another king in the restoration of the monarchy, King Charles II, he actually demanded the expulsion of Locke, even though Locke was already in the Netherlands. Why? King Charles II, after the restoration, he was actually a Catholic. He was a Catholic monarch, and many people were really, really nervous and suspicious of that because they believed that, because at the time, the Vatican, right, was arguing that that I should say that not the laws, but that the Pope ultimately had authority over anyone who's a Catholic, including Catholic monarchs. And so there's a very strong nervousness here that England might return to being ruled by the edicts of the Catholic Church, or the papal system in the Vatican. And so there's very nervousness, and Locke publicly spoke about this. And so he was eventually forced to, he was already in the Netherlands and then he was expelled. And in 1688, William and Mary were crowned, who were the Protestant monarchs, return. And as a Protestant, Locke then returns in 1689. When he returns, or just before he returns, he publishes his two most important books. The first one is called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. And this text principally focuses on Locke's theory of knowledge and his theory of reality. And unlike Hobbes, I should be a little bit careful here, because Hobbes wrote about epistemology and knowledge and metaphysics, and he wrote about a lot of this stuff too. But his work in those areas is less influential than Locke. Locke, known as a empiricist here, one of the foremost British empiricists, really articulates a vision of the world in An Essay Concerning Human Understanding that hasn't stopped impacting us today. So I'll talk a little bit about that today, but obviously we're talking about political philosophy. Now, his political philosophy is principally contained in his two treatises on government. The first treatise on government, we'll see, is really an argument against the idea that monarchs have divine right to rule. And the second treatise on government is about what he considers to be the actual natural foundation, the foundation in natural law for political government and civil authority. And so his second treatise on government is really the main text, not the first treatise on government, because today no one is really arguing today that people have divine rights to rule. Essentially, Locke won that argument, so we're only looking at the second treatise on government. Now, in 1704, that's when he dies, and he actually dies quietly in his study while reading a book. And he's not the only philosopher to die like that. In fact, a contemporary philosopher by the name of Merleau-Ponty died while actually writing about Descartes' meditations. So I encourage you not to read Descartes late at night. You might die. That was a joke. I hope you got it. Let's go over some of the basic philosophical framework to understand Locke. And of course, there's a lot more that can really be said here, but I find it's helpful to understand some of these basic ideas. Let's start with his epistemology. Again, he's known as a British empiricist. Empiricism refers to knowledge, the idea that knowledge is derived from experience alone. That is, earlier philosophers, Descartes being the most notable example here, argue that some things are known simply as innate ideas. You just know them in virtue of your being conscious, being and having cognitive rationality. John Locke denies this. He says there's no innate ideas. No one can look in their mind and think that and know whether or not there's a God or anything like this. Knowledge always begins with sensory experience. And then from that sensory experience, I build up through memory and through a couple principles, I slowly build up and organize my sense of what the world is, and I develop these ideas. So the mind is a tabula rasa. That's the term he used here in Latin. That refers to the idea that the mind is a blank slate. Now, what's Locke's basic model of the mind? Locke's basic model of the mind is that human beings are always separated from the world of the known. That is, think about it like this, right? I guess I'll use myself as an example, right? Right now, you can't see it, but I'm looking at my computer screen, the thing you can see here that says epistemology and all this. I'm looking at the computer screen, so what's happening is the light waves are flying into my eyes, right? And Locke calls this the first movement of experience. After the light waves go into my eyes, something happens, right? Where those light waves are translated in my mind into representations of the computer screen, right? So that means that I'm looking at the computer screen, but what I actually see is what my mind has already processed in terms of my experience, which means that I'm always removed from the actual object I'm experiencing, right? You can sort of see it like this. Light waves go into the mind, and then from the mind they get translated somehow into what Locke calls the mind's eye. He calls this the second movement of experience. Now, that means that knowledge is always already removed from the object of experience. That means, though, that if all knowledge of the world, no matter what it's about, is always organized through the mind's eye and through reason, right? So reason functions here as a really critical capacity that allows us to have knowledge. And there's a lot more we could talk about. A lot of other sort of interesting epistemological issues arise out of this, but that's the fundamental idea. Now, Locke also divides our perception into qualities of perception. I have primary and secondary qualities. And I won't go over those too much, but we can just sort of generally surmise that the primary qualities of perception are those qualities of perception that appear objective. That is, they seem to depend upon the thing in the world to be what they are. Think about this. I'm drinking a can of sparkling water here, right? One of the primary qualities of my perception here is the solidity of the can. That is, it has a certain solidities. You can bend, but you can see it's not permeable, right? There's not water coming out of it. So that means that my perception, even though I don't have direct access to the can itself, my perception is such that I do have perception of something objective about the can, namely this quality of solidity or something like this. But then the color of the can, right? What color is this? Well, to me, the color of the can looks green. That's a secondary quality of perception because it seems to be subjective. It seems to require a mind to see it, right? And so that means that not all of our experiences are equal in terms of determining what's actually the case in terms of talking about an objective state of affairs. Now, why is all of that important for us? Because we're really interested in looking at political philosophy. Well, in order to help get a sense of it, let me talk a little bit about Locke's moral philosophy. Earlier in the term, I talked about the idea, especially with Aristotle, that politics and ethics are essentially the same discipline, but in terms of scope. With Locke, we really don't quite see that same thing happening, though there certainly is a relationship. Now, I mentioned earlier that Locke was a Protestant, and as a Protestant, of course, he believed that the Bible, you had to follow the Bible no matter what. And so he had what some of us would call a divine command theory regarding moral precepts. That is, things that one should do are commanded by God, right? But the idea here is also that, remember when I talked about the critical importance of reason? The idea here is that God is rational too, because God created us, in his view, as rational agents. With this capacity to reason and understand the world, it implies then that we can use reason to determine what God's commands are. So there's an interesting distinction here for Locke between revealed theology and natural theology. Now, what is this talking about? Because if morality comes from God, then the only way I can know if something's wrong or right is to understand what God has commanded. Now, in terms of revealed theology, that is, I can only know those moral precepts that God commands directly, right? That is, things like the Ten Commandments. You read them in the Bible, God appears, he gives the command. This is the notion of revealed theology. And Locke basically just says, listen, if God commands it, we have to do it. But in terms of revealed theology, we may not understand why. Reason may not be capable of actually of allowing us to understand why God would command one moral precept versus another. For instance, think about in the Bible, right? That God commands, in the Old Testament, he commands certain people to death, right? He commands, for instance, I'm trying to remember in the Bible here, Saul, the first king of the Israelites, right, before David, right? Why does eventually Saul, as the story goes, Saul was forced to give up the kingdom to David eventually, but why did this all happen? Because Saul disobeyed God's commands. And God's command in that story was to kill everyone in a specific city that he was taking over, including all the women and children. Saul didn't do that, and so God got rid of him. Why would God have a person execute what seemed to be innocent people? We don't know. That for Locke, that's an issue regarding divine command theory. Sorry, that thing keeps popping up. That's an issue regarding revealed theology. We don't know, we just accept it. But natural theology is a different sort of thing. The idea there is that God creates the world and he has certain moral precepts that are embedded into the world. And we can use reason to deduce what the natural law is. That is, our moral precepts can be rationally deduced. We can sort of think through what would be the most rational thing to do in terms of action. For instance, killing people unjustly is a precept that we could derive through reason. So we're going to see that even though Locke is certainly interested in maintaining the validity of biblical edicts and religious moral commands and so forth, he ultimately is interested in setting forth a way for reason, for us to determine through reason and not through the Bible or through some other sort of religious means how one ought to act. So that means that and he actually even envisioned that we could formulate a full systematized moral theory here using purely rational deductive means. He was never able to actually do such a thing. In the end of his life, he complained that he was just too old for him to actually think it all through. But he still believed it was possible. Now, why is that important for us? Because we're going to see that this notion of natural law actually plays a pretty important sort of role in terms of his political philosophy. Because he's going to argue that political philosophy is effectively established through natural law. And to the point that he even argues at one point that that's the limit of the power of the government, right? The government can't create laws, or it would be unjust for the government to create laws that contradict natural law. Right now, I want you to see here that John Locke, even though the Enlightenment, it's still really what we might call the time of the Northern Renaissance, Locke is essentially sees this notion that comes really into full fruition during the time of the Enlightenment, which is the idea that reason, with a capital R, if you will, can provide us with the tool for determining what's objectively true and false. Of course, today that view has been significantly attacked and is quite questionable today. But anyway, that's how Locke sets up. Now, when we talk about the political philosophy, which is what we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about in this video, we can really start with this fundamental question that Locke is trying to answer. And that is, what is the basis for our obligation to civil authority? That is, we're all born into a world, into a society. If you're like me, you were born into the United States, or if you're watching this video, you're from another country, you're born into some sort of society in which there is a civil authority. That is, someone's in charge. Whether it doesn't matter if we're talking about democracy or monarchy, or even a Chinese one-party control, right? It doesn't matter. All of those are forms of civil authority. And the question is, what is the basis for our obligation to do what these people are telling us to do what the government says? And in asking that question, we'll probably be able to understand what the limit of that obligation is, if there is a limit. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's two treatises on government. The first one here is against the rule by divine right, which you can see here, Locke really fundamentally joins in Hobbes in this attack, even though even though we should say that Locke is not a materialist. And the second treatise is really the basic argument for contractualism or contractarianism. And contractarianism is essentially the catch-all phrase we use to refer to the idea that the basis for political authority is the idea that we fundamentally, as citizens, as people, have entered into a contract with each other to create a government that could rule us all, right? And you can see that Hobbes is, of course, a contractarian in this sense. Now, that means, where does politics begin? And you're going to see here, I'm going to sort of take you through a sort of jaunt through the second treatise of government. I'm not going to hit on everything that's interesting or even important. I'm just going to talk about the things that I think are really pivotal in terms of the conversation we've been building up through this course. Now, let's take a look at the theory of the state of nature, because the state of nature is a really important concept for any political theory. Now, like Hobbes, the theory of the state of nature here is an ahistorical theory. Locke isn't saying that this state of nature existed at some point, though it's reasonable to assume it may have. This isn't a history lesson. The state of nature is a structural necessity for understanding what a government is, right? Because think about it. In order for there to be governments, there have to also be things that are not governments. That is, you can have situations in which people exist where there's a government and situations where there's not a government. The situation in which there is no government, or society, I should say, is what he refers to as a state of nature. Now, let me zoom in here. In fact, he begins his discussion on the second treatise. I'll read you the first page here. right? Chapter 1, Section 1, of Book 2, rather, Locke argues, it having been shown in the foregoing discourse by positive donation from discourse that Adam had not either by natural right or false fatherhood or by positive donation from God any such authority over his children or dominion over the world as is pretending. Now, what he's doing there in beginning this, and the reason I mention this, is he starts off by recalling the conclusion that comes out of the first treatise on government. And that's the idea that he's rejecting authority by naturalism. And that's my phrase, not his. And that's the idea that Adam, right, who's the sort of first person in the Bible, the book of Genesis, has no natural authority or dominion. That is, that the authority that people have doesn't come through nature, right? Just because I'm a parent doesn't give me a natural authority over my children. Authority is something that's constructed, right? That's the idea there. Now, what is political power here is an important question. He defines it here in this first section here by saying that political power is something like making laws with penalties for the regulating and preserving of property and of employing the force of the community, right? So as we begin to talk about what political power is, what we're talking about here is a society or a government that makes laws, makes penalties, it preserves property, and it uses force force for the community and force from the community. Now, what is the state of nature? The state of nature is, number one, a situation of perfect freedom for Locke. And when I say perfect freedom, I mean you have full natural freedom in the state of nature, right? That you can do whatever you want. Now, we should see, we're going to talk a little bit here about how this is different from Hobbes. So don't think that this is the same notion here, though it sounds very similar. So there's a state of perfect freedom in which everyone is utterly free to do what they want, right? With this caveat here regarding natural law. The other thing is the state of nature is a state of equality. That is, everyone has the same power and jurisdiction. Everyone has the same fundamental powers, bodily and intellectual, and everyone has the same jurisdiction. They principally have jurisdiction over themselves and their labor. In fact, one's property is considered in the state of nature to be one's person and one's labor, what one creates. But that's it. And everyone is in that same fundamentally equal situation. Now, what is the state of nature not? It's not a license to do anything you want. So this is where we're starting to see there's a difference here between John Locke's state of nature and that articulated by Thomas Hobbes. The state of nature is not a state of license because reason dictates a specific law of nature and that exists, right? Every man has the freedom to execute the law of nature. And the laws of nature, which are derived from reason, because remember, everyone's born into the state of nature with rational capacity, equal rational capacity, and everyone can use that reason to deduce best courses of action. And we're all free to do that. Okay, so he doesn't think that a state of nature means that you can just kill anyone you want. In fact, he distinguishes the state of nature. Oops, I think I'm missing something here. He distinguishes the state of nature from a state of war. Now, let's talk a little bit about how exactly does Locke differ from Hobbes. And there's probably many differences here, but I want to give you 4 fundamental differences we can talk about. The first here is that God and nature restrain action. Okay, that is because Locke is still trying to maintain a theocratic, not a theocratic, but a theological worldview here, where he thinks there is a God and there is nature, and so actions are restrained. And then the second here is the state of nature is a state of peace, goodwill, mutual assistance, and preservation. That's from section 19 of the book. And the idea there is that Locke's view is that the state of nature is one in which it's naturally a good thing, right? It's one in which we still have these problems of scarcity and this sort of thing, but where we naturally work together, right? Using reason to figure out how to work together, right? Now, there's a distinction here. The state of nature is what we've been talking about, but a state of war is different. A state of war is what Hobbes is describing. You see, Locke, he wants to demarcate the two, where Hobbes sort of sees the state of nature as a state of war. Locke says they're two different things, but the state of nature can naturally, and probably naturally always does, degrade into a state of war, when really three different criteria can occur in order to make this degradation. Number one is if the law of nature is unclear, right? If people are debating about what the law of nature is in terms of what's reasonable, you can discover conflicts of action. Those conflicts can lead to war. Second here is violations of the law of nature unclear. When it's unclear whether or not an action violates the law of nature. And again, the law of nature here are these precepts deduced through reason. You can see here it's fundamental to Locke here that that reason never be contradictory. And that's sort of where I think we're in trouble in terms of our contemporary use of Locke may lie, right? But if the violations of the law of nature are unclear, then of course conflicts arise, war arise. Another one, of course, this is probably the most basic one in terms of this, is if not everyone obeys the law of the nature, you can degrade into a state of war. So you can see here that there's more fertile soil in Locke for maybe a theory of anarchism than there is in Hobbes, because he thinks that people are fundamentally good and rational, and naturally they're going to work together unless the law of nature is either unclear, there's violations of it are unclear, or people just don't obey it. The other thing that's worth mentioning here is that property rights for John Locke are pre-political, meaning that he thinks that we have property exists before society exists. And what are the fundamental properties here? We already mentioned them. Maybe you'll remember, right? One's person and one's labor. Those are fundamentally one's own. And as such, property rights are pre-political. But my right to have land and my right to have a house and my right to have the freedom of speech and so on and so forth, these rights are politically constituted rights. They're not natural rights. So you can already begin here when even today, if you go to, if you look up, for instance, the United Nations Assembly and the Charter of Human Rights and this sort of thing, oftentimes people will talk about natural rights versus political rights. A natural right is a right that exists in a pre-political state, whereas a political right is one that can only exist when a state or some sort of political community is constituted. Okay, and those will become sort of important as we go later on. Oops, we already covered that. Okay, so let's there's a couple other sort of things that I wasn't sure how to put them in here, but they're worth mentioning. And that's one, and this is one of them. Locke rejects slavery, right? Here's a quotation right for you. Liberty can be under no other authority but that of a commonwealth, legislative power by consent. And here's the really fundamental view of Locke's here, is that slavery is the state of war continued, right? He thinks that what happens is, and remember when John Locke's writing, slavery is endemic across Europe. And it exists in England as well. So he's writing this in a world populated with slaves. Of course, we still have a world populated with slaves, but far fewer, fortunately, than in Locke's time. But you can see here that Locke, and it's interesting because every political philosopher we'll see seems to constantly be expanding the role of rights. And you can see here is that I think Locke sort of stands as an important sort of milestone in that, right? He thinks that in a society with slavery is unjustified because it's obviously, by definition, non-contractual, right? No one would contract with another to give up all of their rights, including their natural rights, right? Even to their own person, right? That's the fundamental thing, is that if I have a natural right to my own person, but I'm a slave, obviously I've lost that right. Now, the idea here is that can't be legitimated. The only way that one can lose liberty is when they live in a system in which they live in a sort of commonwealth where people give power to some other agent, whether that be a parliament or a monarch or a congress. They give power by consent. And of course, slaves are dead. So Locke rejects slavery and offers a pretty good argument against it, unless we get rid of this notion of the Enlightenment use of reason. Because you can see he's hinging it in a sort of deductive manner. So that's pretty important. But you can see here, we'll see an even better argument against slavery coming up here when we take a look at Jean-Jacques Rousseau later on. Now, let me just sort of talk about what's the basic idea of the social contract. It's really simple. The idea of the social contract is we essentially come together when we, through certain circumstances, right, we give up our natural, unalienated freedom, our natural freedom and equality. We give that up because it's mutually beneficial to create a system where we work together, and we're a system where we have obligations and duties to each other. And so we essentially contract the way we talked last time between pact and contracts. Hobbes sort of talked a lot about that. But from here on out, we're just going to refer to this as the social contract idea, is that through some sort of mechanism of consent, we've given the power that civil authorities have to them, which means that the power initially resides in the people, not in the civil authority. You can already see here why maybe monarchs didn't like Locke's philosophy and why he had to flee, among other reasons, certain monarchs, right, and certain systems, because ultimately he's arguing that the social contract resides first and foremost with the citizens, not with the power authority itself, okay? Now, I want to talk a little bit about the right of labor. Whoops, let me go back here, right? What is the right of labor? John Locke, this is fundamentally important, you should put this in your notes, is that for Locke, the whole system of political philosophy gets derived fundamentally from this discussion of property, right? And here's one of the things he says in section 27. Every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his, right? So that's where property begins. And one of the things that Locke argues is that with our labor, right, we own our own bodies, and then with our labor, we mix our labor into the natural world. And that by mixing that natural labor, right, say for instance, if I build a table, I cut a tree down, and then the tree gets mixed with my labor, and then suddenly a table comes out the other end, right? And that his view is going to be is that the things I make with my own hands should be mine, ultimately. It's in a political society gets established to protect that right. Now, labor, additionally, is the source of value. And that comes in section 40. We'll see this is pretty important. And this idea gets picked up eventually, a couple centuries later, by none other than Karl Marx here. But labor functions as the source of value. Now, money, of course, is just the logical derivative of labor. Because what essentially happens is, as soon as I make my table, then I can switch my table out for money, and that money, the cash in my hand, is just a stand-in, if you will, right? It's just a symbol for the labor I have and have used in the world. The other thing is, he seems to, and it's really in section 134, I make the argument, some may disagree, that Locke sort of makes the argument that happiness is to be understood as the enjoyment of property. Now, I have to be a bit careful here, because clearly with the theological underpinnings of Locke's system, he probably has a much more sophisticated view of happiness than simply the enjoyment of property. For him, there's probably other conditions that come into play. But the reason I wanted to put that there is because many of you are familiar with the Declaration of Independence here in the United States, and that Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, talks about the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right? Originally, the first version of the Declaration of Independence said the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. And in fact, that phrase comes directly from John Locke. So what I think that Thomas Jefferson made a good edit by saying it's the pursuit of happiness and not saying happiness is just property. But John Locke thinks that. And in fact, the entire political arrangement in the United States is based structurally on that idea. Now, that means civil authority exists to protect the rights of labor. So you can see that when the rights of labor are attacked, that means that civil authority is failing in its mission. That's fundamental. So the right of labor is really critical for Locke here. Now, what's the ultimate end of political society? Now, when I say ends, there's this famous distinction that goes all the way back in philosophy, called I should say famous distinction, but if you go all the way back into to Aristotle. Aristotle talks about the final ends towards which things aim. That is, what's the final goal of political society at all? Why have it? What's the final reason? What's the answer to the question why? That is, what is the fundamental end towards which politics exist? And so what I want to talk about here is sort of the logic, give you a sense of the logic he makes here. Here's the first thing. This comes from section 123. Man relinquishes freedom to avert fear for mutual preservation and property, right? So that means, it's interesting because people misunderstand this quite a bit, right? People think that the United States, the political constitutions are written, like in the United States, in order to create freedom. Ironically, that's not, it's actually the reverse. Actually, as soon as a political constitution is created, and people agree to it and consent to it, they're actually giving up their freedom. They're giving their freedom to a legislative or some sort of representative body, right? So we're actually giving up our natural freedom. Now, the thing that's beautiful about it is by giving it up, we actually gain new freedoms. That's what the difference here between natural and political rights, right? But I may give up certain natural freedoms, but now guess what? I have a lot other freedoms and privileges that are constituted in this political system that I would have never had for otherwise. But you can see it's pretty important here because as soon as you can see it takes us direct, that it goes in the direct opposite too. Because what happens if I live in a society where fear where I'm in total fear and there's no longer preservation for my body or for my property? At that point, the government no longer has any sort of jurisdiction. Think about it. Then take, for example, what's been occurring and has occurred and is occurring in Syria right now. Right now in Syria, and I don't want to get into a big debate about it, but right now in Syria, the government there's a civil war in which the government is actively killing its citizens, and the citizens are actually actively killing other citizens. You have a situation where people no longer have preservation of both their body or their property, and people are living in fear. And you can see in that situation, it doesn't really make sense to talk about a political constitution existing any longer, and that's going to be pretty important here. That's sort of just sort of sign of things to come here. Now, let's go talk about this. The preservation of property thus requires a couple of things in particular. Number one, it requires the establishment of law. You need specific guidelines and laws, and those laws are based upon really the will of those people who give up their natural freedom, right? So that means the government should be inherently representative, right? But the preservation of property also requires indifferent judges. It requires some sort of judicial mechanism whereby conflicts of property right can be determined, or rather adjudicated, or solutions found. But in order to find solutions that would be equitable, you need judges who don't have particular biases, right? And so the next thing you need, of course, is you need the power of enforcement, right? You need the power for enforcement. You need a legislative power. That's the power to articulate these laws of nature. And by the way, that's Locke's idea here, right? Is that anything that's legislated should ultimately be derived from these laws of nature. Now, the executive power, he just says, is the power to punish. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But you can see here, you can already start to see in Locke here this distinction between the executive, the legislative, and also the judicial. But I should say that Hobbes makes similar distinctions. Now, forms of government. Here's some interesting stuff for Locke. The primary form of government, thus, is democracy. Why? Because social contract begins with this idea that we're all equal and that we give up part of our equality in order to constitute a society in which we can live better lives. That means that fundamentally democracy is the most representative model for government, because democracy begins with the supposition that everyone has an equal stake, right? And so there's a structural alignment between the fundamental natural basis for government and the I'm sorry, something beeped. I lost track of what I was saying, right? But democracy is structurally aligned here with what Locke sees as the fundamental principle that undergirds any social contract. But what he thinks is that democracy gives way to oligarchy and oligarchy gives way to monarchy. So they're actually derived in this sense. So you can see that Locke has essentially switched out the order of legitimate forms of government, right, as compared to Plato, Aristotle, or even really Thomas Hobbes, right? You can see here this notion for a social democratic or representative form of government really finds its home in Locke. Really, I think a little bit more than Thomas Hobbes. Now, when he talks about monarchy, there's two types of monarchy. Because remember, the people he's writing to are people who live in a monarchy, right? So he's writing in the world that has only monarchies around it for the most part. So that means that even though he's talking about democracy here, and today that's much easier for us to talk about, in his own day, monarchy is what it actually exists. And there's two types. There's elected monarchies and there's hereditary monarchies. And he actually thinks both are legitimate, both an elected and hereditary. Of course, most of what we see are the hereditary monarchies. Now, here's something, is that the social contract he's talking about regards the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth is any independent political community, but a commonwealth need not be a democracy. So again, there's any type of government that essentially follows or fulfills the fundamental principles that he's going to be articulating in his contractarian philosophy is going to be considered a commonwealth. Democracy definitely meets that criteria, but not every commonwealth needs to be a democracy. So whenever we talk about democracy, we should distinguish from commonwealths. And by the way, we might be interested in thinking about this distinction today. Today, it's become fairly, I think, a matter of course for politicians and people to talk about exporting democracy or democratic forms of government across the world. Maybe we shouldn't be involved in that. Maybe instead we should be using the language of a commonwealth. And I think we might be in better shape, at least in terms of how we negotiate with other states if we were to. So there's something interesting there that I think actually has real resonance today in terms of talking about actionable sorts of policies, especially in foreign relations. Anyway, let's talk now about the establishment of the legislative power for Locke. Now, this I call the first and fundamental law of social contract theory for Locke. And I'll just read you this quotation from section 134 of the book. The great end of men's entering society being the enjoyment of their properties in peace and safety, and the great instrument and means of that being the laws established in that society. By the way, notice here that laws are essentially an instrument, that is, they have instrumental value to establish this final end that we're looking for. And the first and fundamental positive law of all commonwealths is the establishing of the legislative power as the first and fundamental natural law, which is to govern even the legislative itself, that is, the preservation, of the society and of every person in it, right? And insofar as it constitutes the public good, right? Now that means this legislative is not only the supreme power of the Commonwealth, but sacred and unalterable in the hands where the community have once placed it. What he's going to argue here is that the most important part of any Commonwealth is the legislative power. That is, whoever writes the laws, right? That's the most important things. And you can see here, he just says right here that the laws exist for the public good and the preservation of that society, such that any sort of political society that creates laws that are contrary to that purpose, that is, contrary to the public good, and that part is easily debated, right? It depends on which side. But also, any law that's contrary to the preservation of society is ultimately going to be fraught with problems for Locke. Because this is the sort of first and fundamental law of any politics, that is the legislature. Now, one of the things that's interesting here, here, I'll go here. Some of the characteristics that he talks about the legislative authority. Number one is the legislature is the supreme authority. That is, they're the top dog, right? It's interesting. That means if, in terms of American politics, the Congress is the fundamental authority of the United States, not the executive, not the president, right? Or if you're talking in England, the Parliament is the fundamental supreme authority, not the king or the prime minister. Now, in commonwealths where you have an absolute monarch, the monarch would play the role of both the legislative and the executive role. We'll see Locke doesn't like that. He thinks they should be separate, and he's effectively arguing for the supreme authority of the parliamentary system of his own day, which is fairly controversial, right? Because monarchs in their own day wanted more authority, not less. You can see his philosophy here is saying that the executive plays second fiddle to the legislative or to the parliament in his own day. And you can see how that could automatically be conceived as problematic, but of course, in the 1500s, this was at least settled to some degree with the establishment of the parliament. Anyway, let's not talk about that. The other thing here is that the legislative cannot make arbitrary decrees, section 136, right? The legislative body or power can only make laws that fulfill this common good, the preservation of society and the protection of property and so forth. But they can't just make arbitrary decrees, things that don't make sense, or things that have no purpose. And you can see here, this is where we might say, wait a second, it seems like the American legislative system has a certain arbitrariness in its decrees, or you could argue that, but he says it shouldn't do this. The other thing is that the laws must be based upon the laws of nature. That is, the laws have to be reasonable. Unreasonable laws have no place in the Commonwealth because they don't fulfill natural law. Now, you can see here, if we attack the whole idea of natural law itself, a lot of these really nice things that we want to maintain in his political philosophy, you can yank the yarn and sort of out of the sweater here and unwhittle the sweater. Right, and so there's an issue here because ultimately all of his political philosophy is sort of based on this notion of the supremacy of reason in natural law. If that's not true, then there's issues that you're going to have to account for. I'm thinking of ways that you might, in your papers, for instance, want to attack or criticize Locke today. Let me go here. The next here is that absolute or arbitrary power and the ignoring of standing law is inconsistent with the aims of government, right? So that means that if the legislature tries to pass laws that are inconsistent with other laws, then that creates obviously a problem because the aim of government should ultimately be towards one rational end. So you might also, an interesting question here is, does, for instance, the United States Congress create inconsistency in its own form of government? Now, of course, I would say it does, but the judicial system exists in order to arbitrate those inconsistencies. Now, let's keep going. The supreme power cannot take property without participatory consent. So that means that the government, even though it is the government, can't just take people's property. Now you can see here that this claim in section 138 essentially would function, philosophically that is, as a counter to any sort of I'm thinking of like the Bolshevik Revolution and the emergence of sort of Soviet communism, right? None of that would ever be legitimate because you can't just take people's property without their consent. Now, what about taxation? Because taxation is a form of property taking, but it is legitimate so long as there's a consent of the majority, right? So long as there's a consent of the majority. Another spelling error, I see. Sorry, little typo, right? But that's the fundamental idea, is that you can tax so long as there's a consent of the majority. And we're going to see here is that for Locke, the majority is essentially the principle that allows for us to determine which laws are good and which laws are legitimate and which ones aren't in a civil society. Okay, so you can't just take anything, but taxation is allowed, and other forms of property taking would be allowed under the scheme, ones in which the majority would agree to. You can see how, for instance, in the United States we have provisions, and the Constitution itself talks about this, of eminent domain. You can't take property unless it's in the public good of some sort, the general public good, everyone's general good. And so we essentially just model our own system here on this idea. Now, there are 4 limits to legislative authority we have to talk about. The first is you must govern by promulgated established laws. What does that mean? Locke talks about this. Really, this means the idea that you have to establish laws that are universal in their reach and in their effect on others. That is, you can't make a certain set of laws for the poor and a certain set of laws for the rich. That is illegitimate because, remember, the legislative authority for any contractual system of a commonwealth depends on everyone's consent, the rich or the poor. And so making laws that for instance, help the rich but penalize the poor, or laws of this sort, would be, in Locke's view, illegitimate. And that's part of the limit of the legislative authority. Now, always the devil's in the details, right? And you can see how even in America, the debate, for instance, between taxation, right? And you can think about Obamacare here, right? Or the Affordable Health Care Act, right? Some people say, listen, the Affordable Health Care Act puts too much pressure on certain business owners, and such as economically not feasible. And so the argument goes, in order to make it economically feasible, that is, in order to fulfill a general social good here of wealth, we should allow a certain exception to certain groups for the healthcare, the use of the healthcare law. So you can see that the devil's in the details, but in general, laws have to be, they must govern by promulgated established laws. Now, and that means they have to be consistent over time. The next thing is that all laws should aim for the good of the people, right? And this, of course, the devil's in the details again, but the laws should naturally do this. Laws that are obviously contrary to the good of the people should not be enacted, and so forth. Taxes should not rise without the consent of the people, right? You can see here that this one is particularly apt when we talk about the American political experiment. You've no doubt heard, if you're an American citizen, this idea of there should be no taxation without representation. That just comes right from Locke, right? You can see why the founding fathers for the American political system were intimately acquainted with John Locke's philosophy here. Now, also, the other idea is that the legislative authority cannot transfer the power to make laws to another body. That is, since the legislative power is the supreme authority, it cannot give itself away, right? And it's interesting here, if you read the Constitution, right? Go ahead and take a look and read the Constitution, but the Constitution talks about the amendment process, right? But there's a couple of things that the Constitution says cannot be amended. That is, they cannot change even with an amendment to the Constitution. And those laws essentially concern this. That is, the Congress cannot, by law, destroy itself. Can't, by law, pass a law to get rid of itself. That can never happen in any amendment process, right? And those are there in the Constitution to protect this sort of clause in the legislative authority. Now, okay, let's move here. We could talk about the legislative and the executive here, right? But here, Locke makes a pretty important argument for the idea that the legislative and executive powers ought to be separate. Now, here's where Locke gets it. In England, they are separate to some extent because of the Parliament. But definitely in France at the time, or other nations, this is not the case. Now, what's the idea? Is that the legislative power should be in diverse hands, he says. Many people should be in it. Why? Because in order for the legislative power of a civil commonwealth to make the best laws, those laws need to be based upon a representative measure of what the good of the people is. That means that if you just have one person making laws, and especially one person who's also the executive, like an absolute monarch, that person is not going to be making laws in all likelihood that are diverse enough to meet this criteria of contractual consent. So the legislative power should be representative, and in so doing, it should require a whole diverse group of people, right? You can see this is why democracy is better here than oligarchy or monarchy in his view. Now, the executive power, and the executive power here by him is symbolized here. What he calls the executive power is essentially that power to punish those who don't follow the law. That is, the executive power exists to execute the law, right? You can think of the police and so forth. Now, he says that there's a separate power of the state, and he calls it the federative power. And that's the power to make war and peace and engage in transaction between states. This is the foreign power. So he says that there's a separate thing here between the executive executing the laws within a state, and there's a whole separate power here of the government essentially engaging in foreign affairs. And he says it makes sense for the most part. These two things are usually combined into one executive. And that just makes sense because it's essentially this similar function of execution. But he says that they are structurally and philosophically separate roles, separate powers. And he even suggests that it's conceivable that you You could have one executive who has the federative power and another who has the sort of natural domestic executive authority. But he says most of the time they're squashed together. In the United States, we see that these things are put together. Some people have even argued maybe because the United States has become such a large and such a powerful country that maybe it makes sense to separate these two out. Because think about it, the President of the United States, when he's worried federatively about, for instance, going to war in Syria, he's not thinking about, well, how are we going to establish X law here? Now, of course, the United States has built up a huge bureaucracy in the executive power in order to fulfill all this stuff. But some people have argued that maybe we should separate these two things now. Maybe we've reached that stage. It's at least conceivable on John Locke's view, though he concedes that putting them together in one executive makes the most sense. Now, what are some of the characteristics of the governmental powers? One is that the executive power is always subordinate to the legislative power. That's from section 152 here, right? That is, the king is always plays second fiddle to the parliament, or the president plays second fiddle to the Congress. The legislative power is the most important power. It's interesting here because most people think that the executive power is the case. It is, at least philosophically, that's not right from Locke's perspective. Now, the legislative power should be representative by periodic intervals of choosing. That's how he actually spelled the word choosing in 1689 here. But that's from section 154. So you can see here he's getting to the notion of voting. And in fact, he'll directly begin to talk about voting and how voting establishment procedures should be organized. And he's always going to say that when voting, the majority opinion should rule, right? But there's different ways that voting could be executed. Where in this video, I'm not going to talk a lot about that. I encourage you to take a look at that online. I just really want to get you the sort of structural sense of the basis for any government without sort of talking about these smaller nuances. The next thing here is that an executive power without authority instigates a state of war with the people, right? That is, an executive power that acts without legitimacy from the legislative is actually creating a state of war with the people. So that means that the executive, in his view, can't just act by fiat, right? And it's interesting, since this has existed for a while in the United States, but especially after George W. Bush and continuing now with President Obama, the United States executive authority here, the presidency, has enacted quite a few what they call executive orders and also executive signing statements. So when the president of the United States signs a law into effect now, oftentimes if it's a law he doesn't like, he will actually put in writing how he plans on not instituting that law. Or other executive orders concern creating new sort of regulations without legislative power. Now, in Locke's view, that's dangerous territory because the executive no longer has authority to do these things if the executive acts without the legislative power's consent or guidance, if you will. So this is an interesting issue here. So he's against, if you will, an all-powerful executive. In terms of concerning parliamentary rules, the executive, he says, though, I put this in here in section 156, he mentions that he thinks the executive should have the power to dismiss the parliament. That is, and constitute new elections. Because sometimes, just from obvious sorts of things we see in our own country, right, the legislative power gets sort of gridlocked into a certain sorts of problems in which they can't act. And because the laws have to be executed, even if the parliament or the legislative can't decide, the executive should have the power to dismiss the legislature and reconstitute the parliament. Now, he's, of course, I think he's also writing this because he also wants to sort of, if you will, what's the word I want to say? Sort of send a message to the monarchies of his day that they still have the power to dismiss the legislature, which is a power that the monarchy had. Okay, so let's keep going here. Now, I'm sort of skipping over quite a bit here because we're running out of time in this video. But those are the fundamental basics of his view of government. Now, of course, he has a system here for what it means to vote and how to count things, count votes by majority and so forth. But the next sort of interesting question I want to focus on in this course is on the dissolution of government. That is, how do governments dissolve? How do they get destroyed? right? Now we have to make a distinction. There's two types of dissolution, Locke says. You can have the dissolution of the government, but you can still have society. But you can also have the dissolution of society, and then you lose the government. So there's two separate things here. The government refers to the sort of formal, explicit means of consent that we've created for compulsory law, and we've created for property protection and so forth. But society is also another sort of system that we've created essentially through consent with each other, but it's informal. Now, you can lose your government but keep your society. And typically, the society will almost immediately recreate or reinstitute a new type of government. But if a society is destroyed, the government gets destroyed with it. So that means the society is a necessary condition for governance, for a government. And if it's necessary, and it's so necessary that if you get rid of it, the government has no sufficient condition to even exist. So there's an interesting distinction there. Well, the thing about like this, during the Civil War, in the American Civil War, we not only saw a dissolution of government, but in the South, I think we saw the dissolution of society itself. Not the society of the North, but maybe the society of the South. And that, for instance, can help explain some of the tensions I think that still persist today in United States governance. Anyway, so we can talk about societies and governments dissolving. Now, what are some of the possible scenarios for the dissolution of government? The first is by external means, and even Hobbes talked about this. You can be invaded, foreign intervention, or force, right? Let me think of a good example. Think about the Mexican-American War, for instance. Mexico had a huge swath of territory, but through foreign intervention, through force, right, the foreign government, in this case the United States, went in there and took over, right? And they essentially dissolved the power of the Mexican government to have a legislative authority in that region of the continent. So foreign intervention can destroy a government. That's sort of obvious. What's more interesting for us is what are the internal means in which a government can dissolve itself. And he seems to say there's really three different possibilities here. One is if the legislative body gets altered in some sense, and I mean radically altered. That is, altered to the point that it is no longer representative, right? That can ultimately lead to a dissolution of the government. Now, the other one here is that the legislative becomes broken in some sense, and then finally the legislature dissolves. Right? Now, the question is, how does this happen? Because there are good examples of when this occurs. And I think we see them in our own day. And I think this is the reason I sort of wanted to focus in our lecture on this topic is because I think a lot of the problems we've been discussing here with our own situation in America, right, and thinking about the Congress and the problems that it's fraught with here, a lot of people are now talking about the idea that it looks like our legislative system is broken, right? Now you can see here, if it's broken, what's the next step here? Dissolution. So we should be worried here because it's sort of interesting because I think a lot of these Congress people, there's a lot of different reasons perhaps for why the Congress seems to be broken, if you want to say that. But I think part of it is there seems to be, looks like, I think we'll actually get an answer to that question when we look at Rousseau next week. But I think that one of the things that's occurring is that as people are acting I don't think that people are representing the common good anymore. They're representing their own particular perspectives, or they're representing very specific groups of people. And I think that's how the legislative is becoming broken. And what's really worrisome is that since it's broken, or if it is broken, people, I think, are becoming essentially suspicious that, well, maybe our system of government doesn't work anymore. And that means we're now moving into this third territory. Now, how does this happen? He actually gives us some interesting ways in which the dissolution government can occur, or at least how the altering and then eventually the brokenness and then eventually the dissolution of the government can occur. Some of I call this how things fail. Some of them include, number one, the misuse of power. Arbitrary decrees instead of laws, right? Think that if laws are set up that always entitle certain groups of people but disadvantage other groups of people, unfair, unjust laws, right? This is one of the ways. And I think there's a way. I think one of the questions here would be to talk about whether or not in the United States the legislature has misused their power. But I don't think we have to be careful there. We can't just say, well, they misused their power by passing Obamacare or something like this. That's not sufficient. We have to talk about misuses of power that actually can be identified as contrary to the public good and as arbitrary, right? So it's a higher order test than just saying I don't like what the government's doing. We would have to prove that what they're doing is fundamentally contrary to the contractual nature of the whole thing, of the whole system, the whole project. Second way is if the legislature is hindered in assembly, structural, right? That is, if the legislature can't meet, right? Or if something hinders the discussion of the legislature while they're in assembly. This is an interesting hypothesis for thinking about America. It's pretty easy. Go on to C-SPAN if you've got some time and if you have cable, and watch who's normally when Congress is debating and talking about things. Notice there's not really any people there anymore. Most of the Congress people don't actually show up to Congress, the actual building, unless there's a vote or something. Now you can see here, part of the whole idea of having the legislative body we have in a democratic republic such as the States is the idea that at the very core of it is discourse and debate. People come together and debate. But what happens when our legislatures no longer actually talk to each other? They only see each other when they vote, and they've already made up their minds. Well, you can see that's a hindrance in terms of the assembly. And so I think you can maybe make a case that that's sort of happening. Think about right now is that most Congress people today spend the majority of their day not talking about which laws are the best. Well, I don't know. Maybe they do. I can't say that for sure. But most Congress people, at least we're told by various news sources, spend most of their time raising money for campaigns, not talking with each other. Another way to think about Democrats and Republicans don't talk. They let their leaders decide what they're going to vote on, right? That's a hindrance to the assembly. All of these things. This is how things fail. Another one here is if the executive arbitrarily alters the electorate. Now this one we don't really see in the United States too much here, but you can see here if there's arbitrary altering of the electorate. Now we do see that there's altering of the electorate in terms of which jurisdictions people are voting and this sort of thing, but those are not arbitrary, and so those would be legitimate, I think, in his view. The other possibility is subjugation for power. I sort of covered that. Another one here is if the executive fails to execute the laws, right? If you have a president who doesn't, actually follow the laws, right? If the laws are passed by the legislative body, but they're not executed, then those laws have no meaning in reality, and thus the system will fail, right? And here's where the final one, and here's where one I think we really need to think about for our own day. If the legislative body loses the public trust. It's sort of like money, right? People always say, what makes a dollar bill valuable? Well, ultimately, what makes it valuable isn't that there's gold, because there is no gold for that bill. What makes money valuable is the fact that we all trust, we put our public trust in it, that we all have agreed to say it's valuable, right? The same thing exists with the legislators. Ultimately, because the legislative body is constituted through the consent of those governed, if those people who are governed no longer trust the government, then you have a problem here. Now, right, we know that today that the U.S. Congress is, in terms of its approval rating, is in single digits. That means that over 90% of Americans do no longer trust that the Congress is acting for the public good. Under those conditions, Locke would predict there's going to be some sort of social contractual failure. And even potentially a dissolution of government. So it's interesting here because those people who are taking this class is if you're an American citizen, most Americans are brought up with sort of the assumption that the Constitution is going to last forever, that the United States government is permanent. I would implore you that, number one, that's just factually false. At some point, the United States will not exist. And, which means, rather, that at some point, the United States, its form of government will be dissolved. Now, obviously, I am in favor of trying to stop that. But you can see it's a very real possibility. And when I see, and I think people would agree, or you can disagree here, but I think what we're seeing is an increasing loss of the public trust in the legislative body. For structural assembly reasons. If that's the case, then we're actually headed towards the dissolution of the Constitution. And I think, which includes all of these constituted rights, things like the right to free speech, right? And so on, the right to privacy, and so on and so forth. Those are all politically constituted rights. And the public trust is really a really key ingredient. If you pull that linchpin out, it looks like the whole house of the deck of cards or whatever seems to fall. So these are some really interesting things that I want you to be thinking about as you read through just Locke's second treatise. Now, what happens? What's the result of the dissolution of government? Locke says, well, immediately natural freedom would return. And when natural freedom returns, because of the problems with the individualism of natural freedom, a new social contract would likely emerge very shortly. So he doesn't think that the state of nature actually exists for very long, for reasons going back to the fact of scarcity and the necessity of resources, natural resources, and so forth. Okay? Now, there's this quote that I thought worth putting here, and I subtitled "The Acting Contrary to the Public Trust," that relates here. What does Locke write? This is from section 221. He writes, first, the legislative acts against the trust reposed in them when they endeavor to invade the property of the subject and to make themselves or any past of the community masters, arbitrary disposers of lives, liberties, or fortunes of people. I'm sorry about the sort of spelling errors in there, or typos. But you can see what he wants to say here is the public trust is clearly violated, right? When, number one, the property of individuals is invaded, right? And it's given to other people in the community when our natural rights, our natural property here is given, other people become masters of our property, or they become masters of us, and they can arbitrarily dispose of lives. They can take, other individuals can take our liberties, our fortunes of people. And here I think I'm not going to make this argument myself, but I'm not going to forward this argument. But here I think there's an interesting way of thinking about, for instance, whether or not the government really should have the right, for instance, to something like the universal mandate to buy private insurance. Now, the reason I think it's interesting here is because the Affordable Health Care Act, right, which has been passed by law and has passed scrutiny by the courts. So this is the law of the land, right? This law constitutes a public. This law constitutes an individual mandate for every person to be required to buy private insurance. Now, the individual mandate, according to John Locke, would be allowable because it would, if number one, if it passed the majorities, which it did, then it has legitimacy, and number two, if it's for the public good, and that argument has been made, and I think it's a good argument. The question, though, that I have personally is whether or not the individual mandate should be made that I have to buy private insurance. That is, all Americans now will be forced to buy insurance from people who are actually trying to make a profit from the selling of insurance. That is, the insurance company does not have the public's interest at heart. It has its own private interest at heart. And to me, there seems to be some sort of tension that builds up here that runs contrary to the public trust. But I don't think, and I think the court's the court's decision maintains this, that constitutes an overt failure of government such that it should be dissolved or something like this. But you can see here that the government should always act towards the public trust, and there's perhaps more fine-tuned ways we could talk about that. And again, let me emphasize, I'm just giving that as an example. That's by no means a sure argument or a best bet. Now, it's interesting here because this is where Locke sort of gets into interesting territory for his own day, because he begins to talk about rebellion, right? And when are rebellions justified? When are they not justified? Now, rebellions seem to occur during the consistent ill usage of arbitrary power. So he doesn't think that rebellions will typically occur unless there's lots of abuse, right? Also, rebellions occur when there's great mistakes, not every little mismanagement. So Locke he even says it explicitly that a small bit of corruption by a few individuals does not constitute a reason to revolt. Sometimes this is referred to as the right to revolution, right? There has to be great mismanagement. It can't be one law. It has to be many laws, for instance. And finally, rebellions are best defended against through representative government. And you can see here Locke is also sort of giving a wink and a nod, I think, to the monarchs of his day by saying, listen, by instituting parliaments and other parliamentary sorts of systems or representative legislative bodies, what you do is you defend against rebellions, because people aren't going to rebel when their own representatives are making the laws, because that's what the representative government here ensures that the laws are for the public interest, or at least that's the notion, right? Now, not all rebellions are justified either, right? He even says it directly. Rebellions are not justified if an active force exists without adequate right of natural law, right? That means that even though someone may rebel and they have the physical means to do so, right? They have the armies and this sort of thing or whatever, to actually institute a rebellion. Think here about the Civil War, right? He says that these rebellions are only justified if they maintain natural law, right? The adequate right of natural law. Such a situation enacts a state of war within a society. So a rebellion, let me go here. A rebellion requires the use of natural law, or at least that's how we could arbitrate, forms of rebellion that are justified. I think under Locke's proposition here, the rebellion in the Syrian civil war is probably justified. Why do I say that? Well, assuming, and here there's some assumptions going into it, right? But assuming that the people who are revolting against the Syrian government are doing so because they believed that their government was not representative. Now remember, this before the Syrian civil war started, the Syrian people were just protesting peacefully in the street, arguing for representative government. And then they started getting attacked by the army, and then eventually it's now exploded into a civil war with the use of chemical weapons and so forth. I think John Locke would agree that probably the rebellion is justified, especially because now the Syrian government cannot fulfill its fundamental civil duty, which is to protect property, including the lives of people, and to preserve peace. It's doing none of that. In fact, it seems to be doing the opposite. And interestingly enough, Locke's theory here predicted why. Because the best form against rebellion is representative government. The dictatorships are not representative, so rebellion is almost inevitable. So you can see here, it's pretty interesting stuff here, right? It seems Locke, even centuries ago, seems to be predicting what's occurring today, and that seems to really, I think, reveal the power and the force of his argument. Now the question is, who judges the state? Who judges? Who decides when the state has gone too far? Who's the final arbiter? The answer is the people. The people judge, he says. That is, the people have a right to act supremely. And that means the people can dissolve the government if they choose to. And they can even continue the legislative authority in themselves and erect new forms of government. Now you can see here, this is the notion of the right to revolution. That if the fundamental sort of elements that bind a state to the people, that is this movement from the state of nature into a civil society, if these sort of fundamental conditions don't get met, then the people do have a right to revolt, and that is a right to revolt violently. He's not talking about here about sort of peaceful demonstration, even though I think he would encourage that sort of demonstration, but he does seem to think and argue that there's a time in which the people can take up arms against not a legitimate government, but against sort of arbitrary government. And it's interesting, that's the very argument, put obviously in contemporary terms, the instigators of the American Revolution made when they instigated their rebellion, right? And their rebellion was based on the idea that they didn't have a representative government, right? And that the laws were made arbitrarily, and that their property was being taken away without consent. And based on those, in John Locke's philosophy here, they had a pretty strong case to do what they did. Now, of course, the question is, it all depends upon the assumption that reason and natural law are possible. If those things aren't the case, you can see here that the system begins to crumble a bit here in these in terms of political philosophy. Well, that's where I want to end today's session. There's so much more in this text that I'd like to talk about, but I want to keep these videos brief and manageable for you. But again, what I really want you to focus on here as you're reading it is I want you to focus on, one, Locke's discussion on the state of nature, and two, Locke's discussion of the dispersion of powers, the difference between the executive, the legislative, and also the federative power, what he calls the federative power, and also the question of what's the limits of the state, when is rebellion justified, and or how do states break down, when and where and why do governments sort of go wrong and fail over time. That's sort of the focus we're going to be talking about, because you're going to see really what I want to do in this course is build up a tool set of theoretical concepts that will allow us to adequately address, I think, the obvious failures that so many of us see in our own society today, so that perhaps we'll be in a better position to actually adjust, motivate the system to improve. So you're going to see next time we're going to be looking at Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and in particular, I'm going to be really focusing on his concept of alienation, his argument against slavery, and I want to focus on Rousseau's discussion of this problem of the general will and why states dissolve. And he actually has the thing he calls a problem of associations that I think answers a lot of our questions. So stay tuned to next week's discussion. Thanks, guys, for watching. I'll see you guys online. Have a great day. Bye.